Welcome. Welcome to our speakers and welcome to our participants online. My name is Marije van Breda and I'm the Educate coordinator. Educate is the Belgian platform for education and development. The platform's goal is providing quality, sustainable and inclusive education to all children and young people. It's the overall objective which connects the members of the platform. We have about 50 members organizations. Before I give the floor to the moderator of the day, Gerrit Coetzee, who is Strategic Education Advisor at VVOB, South Africa. I just want to inform you that the session will last till 2:30 and that you can share questions in the chat box. The moderator will submit the questions to our speakers. I also want to highlight that the session will be recorded and that all the presentations and the recording will be shared on our website, educate.be. The reason why we organize these Connect and Learn webinars is to increase the knowledge by sharing international expertise and good practices with the members of our platform and other interested parties. I wish you a good session. Gerrit, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marije, and good afternoon, everybody. From a freezing cold Pretoria in South Africa. I hope wherever you find yourself that it's much more pleasant and that you're ready to stay with us for the next hour and a half or so. So let us start, and I'll tell you a little bit more about today's topic and to introduce our speakers of today. Today's session is on early childhood education in transition, building foundations for democracy and inclusion. And in the first part of the session, Dr. Jan Peeters from the University of Ghent and Sarah Klaus from Georgetown University will reflect on the origins and legacy of the step-by-step program launched 30 years ago by the Open Society Foundation in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Born out of this moment of profound change, step-by-step introduced democratic and inclusive approaches to early education in more than 30 countries. Jan and Sarah will share how the program inspired radical reforms by building trust among educators and families, and what lessons it offers for strengthening early childhood systems in support of equity and democracy today. Their presentation is based on the open access book, Early Childhood Education in Social and Political Transitions, which they co-authored together with Tatiana Funda from Slovenia. The book draws insights from interviews and focus groups conducted over a 2-year period with international experts and key stakeholders in the step-by-step program. To conclude today's session, we are very privileged to have with us Professor Hasina Banu, who is a full professor and the UNESCO co-chair in early childhood education and care and development at the University of South Africa. Now, I'm biased towards Professor Ebrahim. I've worked with her for many years and we've interacted on many occasions, so it's really a privilege to have her with us today. Professor Ebrahim will offer insights from her country, where early childhood development has undergone significant transformation. She will reflect on 2 decades of policy development, current challenges, including the recent integration of early childhood development into the Department of Basic Education. And by the way, I'm moderating today from one of the offices here at the Department of Basic Education. And the role of VVOB's Funda Udlale Nathi program in addressing systemic barriers and professionalizing the early childhood development workforce. Our three speakers have impressive CVs, and it will take too much time for me to explain and read everything here, and at the same time, I would be selling them short if I did not mention everything. And therefore, we would like to refer you to the link that you will find in the chat, where to the website where you will find their CVs. As indicated by Marie, I would like to invite you to post your questions in the chat for further discussion after the presentation by the presenters. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Jan Peeters. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about our book and about the step-by-step program. Our presentation is based on experiences of the step-by-step early childhood education program, which aims since 1994 to establish foundations of democracy and inclusion in 30 countries in Europe and Eurasia after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We interviewed more than 40 people actively involved in the program, and together we had at the end 600 pages of scribed interviews, and on this basis we wrote a book about their experience together with our colleague Tatjana Funda from Slovenia. Today we'll share with you some of the lessons learned to support successful transitions to democratic inclusive practice. I worked for VVOB as a consultant from 2019 to 2021. I did evaluation of 3 projects in Vietnam and South Africa. And when writing the book on step-by-step, I saw that there are many links with the missions of VVOB between the step-by-step experience and between your work. For example, the focus on equal opportunities and contributing to peaceful and democratic society and enhance individual well-being, for instance. There are also the main objectives behind the step-by-step program. Personally, I have very good memories from the time I worked for VVOB in South Africa and in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there was a focus on child-centeredness. I saw that there was a very good balance between learning activities guided by the teachers and moments when young children could choose their own activities. I experienced also in the centers I visited in Vietnam a warm and stimulating environment in the early childhood schools. In South Africa, I participated in continuous professional developmental sessions for different actors in the early childhood systems. There was a high level of participation of all the people involved. In both projects, democratic practice and continuous professional development were promoted. They work with community of practice, with action research, all very participative way of looking to practice. And when VVOB proposed this Connect and Learn session, I was very happy to participate because of the connections between the values of VVOBs and the values of the step-by-step program. I'm going to turn now the presentation over now to Sarah, who worked at Open Society and led the step-by-step program for many years. She is going to tell you about step-by-step, how it built off the moment of the political changes in Europe when the Berlin Wall fell. She will also tell you how it was implemented and where it is today. And then I will share with you a lesson learned about how to introduce democratic and inclusion in early childhood systems from the many interviews that we conducted. Sarah, I give the floor to you.
Okay, so first, just to say how pleased I am that we're paired with Professor Ebrahim, who's going to share a similar story from South Africa after the fall of the apartheid regime, because I think they're very interesting, similar contexts. They're moments in history where there was a profound reform in early childhood that was catalyzed by transitions in the early education system. And what's interesting to me is that our stories take place over decades. So I'm going to give an overview of step by step, a little bit about what it was like in Eastern Europe and Eurasia before step by step was implemented, and then what step by step did to introduce child-centered inclusive pedagogy and what it achieved. And then Jan, as he mentioned, is going to talk about lessons learned for successful programs. So just to start, I think also that we heard a little bit that Step by Step was the flagship early childhood program of the Open Society Foundation network. So it operated, Open Society operated an early childhood program from 1994 up to 2020. And it's notable because it's one of the largest international early childhood education programs. So over 26 years, Open Society worked in more than 30 countries, mostly in Europe and Eurasia, Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and invested more than $140 million in reform of early childhood education systems. And we'll see that at the 10th anniversary of the program, it had reached more than 200,000 teachers, 500 universities, millions of children and their parents, and it had accreditation from the Ministries of Education for this new approach to preschool education. But one thing that's interesting about the program, and I'm interested in this program in South Africa, is it was very important that the program also created civil society organizations, a professional NGO in each country, and changed the ecosystem in each country. And those organizations worked together to create the International Step by Step Association, which is one of the professional regional networks that exists now, together with, you may know, AFCAN or the RNEC, the Asia Regional Network. And these organizations and this cadre of progressive professionals inspired a lot of not always visible changes in policies, curricula, and training programs. So let's go back in time. This is a photograph from 1950s from a kindergarten in Russia at New Year's. And I wanted to say a word about the situation of early education in Eastern Europe and Eurasia before the changes. So the first thing to say is that this is a very diverse group of countries, right? The former Yugoslavia is very different from the former Soviet Union countries, and they're very different from Central Eastern Europe. So what I'm talking about are some trends rather than something that's uniform across the countries. But in all of these countries, we need to recognize they built large early childhood education systems to make sure that women could work. And this was especially important after the war, when many men lost their lives. And they tended to sort of prepare centralized curriculum, lesson plans, very rigid schedules, you know. Parents brought their children to the kindergarten and the state educated them. So the parents weren't very involved, and there was a real focus on collectivism. But by the 1990s, as the communist governments changed into more democratic governments, the economies were really failing, and many kindergartens really were in terrible shape. There hadn't been investment in them. The local governments couldn't necessarily keep them open, and many of them were being sold off, actually, and kindergartens were closing. At the same time, I want to emphasize that these kindergartens had magnificent staff trained in early childhood development with very high levels of education. They offered good meals, health, and activities, and you can see that children played and they learned. There were many good things about them. In the 1990s, as these political transitions took place, it's very true that parents were looking ahead and they wanted a different life for their children. They wanted their children to have a different education to the education that they had had. And they were curious about the West. They were interested in adopting some new approaches. And I should say I was at Open Society at the time, and Open Society was very ready for these changes because Open Society had a national foundation in almost every country in the region. And those foundations had their own independent board, they had their own education staff, and they hired onto staff some early childhood experts to work on the program. One of the people we interviewed noted that it was a magic time, and This picture is one of my favorite ever. It's a picture of Step by Step in Bosnia after the program started. The kids are making a globe in the courtyard. So what did Step by Step do? Well, Open Society's main office is in New York at the time, and they partnered with Georgetown University and drew on the incredible experts of the U.S. Head Start program. So Head Start is a very inclusive federal program of the United States that reaches the children, families experiencing poverty, and it really includes it's a financing program of early education. It provides the states with funding for early childhood, and it provides standards, but there's a lot of flexibility in the curriculum. And we used this as a model because we could adopt a program that allowed all of these different countries that were joining to do it in their own way. And we paired national experts from each country with US experts. They visited each other. We brought the teams from Europe and Eurasia to visit the US programs. Something I wanted to emphasize is that we signed memorandums of understanding with each government. And I can't emphasize how important this is a step at the beginning, because what we signed, we agreed that after 2 years of the program, after it was implemented, that we would work together to implement the program with the government. We would evaluate it, and if it was approved, any kindergarten in the whole country could take up the program, right? So not just these 10, and that was very important. We also worked very intensively with the first 10 or so kindergartens for a whole year before we expanded. And then expansion happened. So you can see this is a really big curve. So if we started with 1,200 teachers, by 2004, there were over 200,000 teachers across the 30 countries. And we were covering now not just teachers of 3 to 5-year-olds, but also early primary school teachers, teachers working with infants and toddlers. We worked with teacher training institutions, and we developed special programs to ensure inclusion of Roma children and children with disabilities. But you know, when you expand like this, you have to guarantee and think about quality, because things happen fast. So we worked with experts from 11 of the countries to develop quality principles that the International Step by Step Association has taken further and continues to use in new ways now. We also continue to support strategic divergence, right? Every country has to be able to do their own thing in their own way with the curriculum. We can't expect that there's going to be 100% similarity to the teacher training programs. And as I mentioned before, Open Society from 1998 really spun the programs off. That's the word we use, spun off like a top, and helped create these new NGOs. So I want to show you, these are the pictures of the NGOs logos from when they established the International Step by Step Association, and you can see everyone had their own identity. Liana Gent now is the executive director of ISA, and when we interviewed her, she talked about how monumental it was that the program built this large civil society network in addition to focusing on changes in the curriculum. I'm going to end there, actually, and turn back over to Jan, who's going to take the next step in Step by Step and share lessons learned. So Jan, over now to you. Oops, there we go. Oops, you're on mute.
Jan.
Yeah, let's talk about now which kind of factors are crucial for inclusive and democratic programs. First, we will look at what is important when you choose a program, which kind of program are interesting, which others are not. What can we learn from the step-by-step concerning implementing a program, and also building excitement to expand, to motivate people to expand the program. And then also let's talk about the importance of NGOs, networks, and the international community. First, choosing a program. So what we saw is, Sarah already talked about it, that the program was from Head Start. So, and Head Start was also a very broad program. And we see that a program must be not too descriptive. We may not have a program that prescribes what teachers should do. because the program must be adapted to the local context. It means, is it an early childhood program in remote areas in the mountains, or is it in the city? There must be a possibility to adapt it to local context. Then another very important point, what we are seeing is that the program must have sufficient capacity, and capacity to have enough well-trained teachers, but also capacity in providing educational materials for teachers, of course, but also for parents, and also material for young children. And we saw that when that collaboration with the Head Start program, that was really great, because then they had already materials, and the materials could be adapted and translated in the language of the different countries. And then what can we learn from implementing a program? Trainers and project managers must have the necessary expertise on inclusive early childhood pedagogy, and must also be able to create a climate of trust. And such a warm climate of trust is really essential for teachers and for members of the project staff to develop ownership of the implemented program. And that was very obvious if we look at the content of the interviews that we have done, that how important this ownership is. And it also matches with my own experience with projects I did myself in Belgium, but also in other countries, how important the trust, the climate of trust is for the ownership, and the ownership is important for the sustainability. When the teachers don't feel themselves owner of the innovations, then it will be a problem for sustainability in the future. Also important is that the program creates a climate of openness and of flexibility, in which teachers have the space to reflect on their daily pedagogical practice, and this must give them the freedom to try new pedagogical methods. So reflection first, and then have freedom to try out new things. Future early education reform projects can take inspiration from the idea that the female gender regime, which is so typical in early childhood settings, can also be used to leverage changes that reinforce democratic early childhood systems. And we see that in nearly all countries, the teachers, 95 to 97%, in some countries even 100% of all the teachers are women. And normally we look at the fact that the salaries are not high, but a gender regime, a female gender regime, has also advantages because it's characterized by a flat hierarchy. It's based on a warm approach and on strong, harmonious relationship with children and parents from diverse backgrounds. And in the interviews, I was personally very touched by the success of the step-by-step program in mobilization of strong women, especially in countries that have experienced armed conflicts. We see how there the women brought together people from ethnic groups that were in conflict, in armed conflict with each other, and they brought them together around the topic of early childhood education. Step by step reinforces the importance of ensuring that the program embeds values of democracy in early childhood at different levels of the early childhood systems. So it must be on the level of the classroom, of the level of professional and parent NGOs, on the level of training institutions, in-service training, pre-service training, and also on the level of the government, local government and national government. According to several interviewees, Step by Step introduced a foundation of democratic, inclusive early childhood education that national governments and international partner organizations like the World Bank, UNICEF, and the European Commission have been able to build on. And then we have something also very important, how to build excitement and how to have the capacity to expand the program. Continuous professional development was organized at what they called retraining institutes, so in-service training institutes, and sometimes also at model kindergartens and primary schools. And personally, I found this approach of model sites very inspiring for future programs. Model sites were important for building an understanding of the program. In each country, a small number of kindergartens and primary schools were selected and developed into demonstration model sites. Those model sites were open for visitors, but also for policymakers and educators and students. They showed that an innovative approach works effectively, and that's very important. And they are very important not only for the teachers, for the trainers, for new trainers, and for parents, but they can also play an important role in getting policymakers and also donors excited about the new approach so that they invest in it. And then NGOs, networks, and the international community. After 1998, Open Society focused on developing civil society organizations as the leading actors of change. NGOs were set up to continue to develop and expand the step-by-step program, and their role included embedding it into the education system. This approach was effective in most countries and made the program less dependent from the changes in government, what is sometimes a problem in a lot of countries. Our research on step-by-step showed also that international networks can play an important role in promoting an inclusive and democratic approach. The establishment of the International Step-by-Step Association as a network of NGOs created a forum for professional sharing, for exchange, and also very important for advocacy. ISA has become the go-to network for practitioners and other professionals from Europe and Eurasia, and is respected for its expertise and contributions to the field. ISA is one of only 8 non-governmental organizations in the European Commission Working Group on Early Childhood Education and Care, and ISA is also recognized as a partner by UNICEF, WHO, OECD, and other global networks and partners. Another lesson from the step-by-step program is that the transfer of knowledge and ideas about pedagogical practice inspires innovation. During the 30 years of step-by-step, there was a transfer of knowledge and expertise between different countries and even between different continents. There were, for instance, the ideas of the American John Dewey, but on the other side, there were also the Italian pedagogue Loris Malaguzzi and the Belarusian Vygotsky that had an influence on the step-by-step program. And the fact that it was influenced from so many different sides makes that the step-by-step program is very rich. In addition to linking Eastern European and Eurasian early childhood experts with their counterparts in the United States, the program created avenues for collaboration across countries participating in the step-by-step program. This crossing boundaries, like we call it, is also used by Educate with this Learn and Connect initiative. I think that Educate is therefore an excellent tool to implement the transcontinental learning. Most donors invest in programs for 2 or maximum 5 years. The step-by-step program was completely different. It was a long-term program. It was funded for more than 20 years and has existed for a very long period, for the moment already 31 years. And this is an advantage. And we have examples in the book illustrate how important improvements in the education system sometimes appear years later after the projects have already finished, and therefore the experience of such long-term programs are very important. And then to finish, the Open Society Foundation funding for the Early Childhood Program has ceased, but the legacy of the step-by-step program lives on. A democratic, inclusive approach towards education is for the moment under threat in many countries. So it is very important to learn from the experience of this long-term project, which has helped to introduce democratic, inclusive pedagogy in more than 30 countries in Europe and beyond. In an increasingly polarized world, it is more relevant than ever to invest in an early and primary education that responds to the diversity of families and communities. In an early childhood system that puts children's involvement, parents' engagement, and teachers' inventiveness at the center, and that pursues equal opportunity, inclusion, and participation. So that was an introduction. Here you see you can download the free copy of the book, and you can also have more information on the website of ISA about the whole program of early childhood education by step. So that was as I think that you will have a lot of questions, and and together with Sarah, we are very curious to hear your reactions and your questions.
Thank you so much, Jan and Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think what struck me was just the way, if I think you spoke about the Soviet era and establishing the step-by-step program out of that. And some of the key things that you've mentioned is, how do you create buy-in? How do you ensure this program moves from small to bigger? And now in 2025, that conversation is pertinent in many organizations when we talk about collaboration to scale. And it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing those lessons with us and for your insights. Before we go to questions, I think it's perhaps prudent to listen to a South African experience. And we are privileged to have Professor Hasina Ebrahim with us. So Prof, if you are ready, we want to hand over to you.
Thank you very much for having me on this platform and letting me add my voice as a case study to what was presented by Sarah and Jan. Larissa, can you project the PowerPoint for me, please? I think the insertion of the South African narrative into what was presented gives you a case study of what happens in a country that is so deeply divided, and how they have moved from a very separate, hierarchical, oppressive space to a democratic space that has some key lessons to be learned of how a deeply divided society comes together and makes something using early childhood as a vehicle for transition. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to discuss today, just to give you an overview of what is the narrative, the South African narrative in relation to early childhood and development. So I'll quickly go over the apartheid era, the onset of democracy, the maturing of the democracy, and the shifts and the affordances. And I think that would give you this little journey that we've traveled in order to institutionalize democracy in South Africa. Next slide, please. And so, looking at the era of apartheid, one of the key themes that throws out for early childhood is separate and unequal early childhoods before 1994. And you can see the kinds of, it's very symbolic that you have in the fourth slide that you have the hands repeated there, and we have it twice, because it was really a system of control in so many different ways. So the impact of apartheid was, this kind of separate development, ideological struggle of what it means to be human, and how color played out in terms of who got what resources and so forth. So the racial segregation in early childhood meant that there was white privilege, and for the rest, there was kind of a disadvantaged response to how they were treated in society. And for early childhood, that meant that your approaches, like the Frobelian approaches, your Montessori approaches, your high scope approaches, were more prevalent in the white preschools because they had a pre-primary system incorporated into the government system with trained teachers. And the rest of the populace were subjected to home-based care. And a few of the NGOs started to spring up at that time. They were supported by foreign donor funding, and they were able to set up preschools within facilities that were attached to some of the communities. And so that's how this idea of out started to emerge during the apartheid era. But what also happened was the issue of having the system organized in such a way that the investment allowed very little to happen. And that is why there was disproportionate resourcing for people of color. And so if you look at the whole picture there, it tells you about a sense of a desire for collectivism, a desire for an inclusive society. And so 1994 was quite a euphoric moment for us as we proceeded in terms of the democratic practice and so forth. Next slide, please. And so the onset of democracy is about the reconstruction of early childhood. And we have a constitutional democracy with multiple freedoms that are entrenched in the Constitution, because that was the depth and level of apartheid that concerned us in terms of what it meant for knowing yourself, what it meant to have a sense of belonging and so forth. And then South Africa adopted a rights-based framework. And in 1995, we signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so when you look at the timeline in terms of what happened in South Africa over the period of time from 1994 right up to about 2014, those little icons tell you a story about different building blocks to help early childhood become visible within the space of education and within the space of societal change. So we adopted a concept of early childhood development. And that was done because of the dire state that children were, as in the younger citizens, and the concern there was around survival at that time there. So the physical, social, emotional, intellectual development of the children was key, placed in the context of disadvantage. And what it also did, the concept of ECD, was to bridge the divide between care and stimulating education. Well, custodial care was normally characterized in structures for children of color. And white children mostly had stimulating early childhood care. So education and care. So to bridge the divide, the concept of ECD allowed for things to happen. And so I won't go through each of those little building blocks, but it suffices to say that when political structures come together with a commitment towards transformation and equity, then things can really move quite fast. And on our side, one of the key groups that functioned as a pressure group was the non-governmental organizations that were supported by philanthropy in the apartheid era and that pressed on. And so we started to see that when the policies were developed, people were asking, but what about early childhood? Where is early childhood in all of this that we're saying? So in 2001, when there was a white paper on early childhood, the early childhood pressure group that was formed through the NGOs and a couple of business partners and so forth started to look at, well, what is possible for early childhood? And a conversation started to develop and morph into greater structures and so forth. So by the 2000s, we are starting to see these new structures of interdepartmental committees looking at, if you wanted holistic child development for an inclusive democratic society, that you had to pay attention to the social cluster, which is health, social development, and education. But one of the things that we really suffered from because of the apartheid geography was that we didn't really know what early childhood looked like. So the mapping exercise came about with the first audit in 2001. And that audit was able to give us data on the provinces, the race, the racial profiling, the locations, and the urban-rural divides. And then this data helped to inform where are the areas of greatest need. But at that time, what we were finding, and we still find them, a lot of informal ECD services sprung up and unregistered sites. So the data quality was also problematic. And so the infrastructure gaps, which the audit looked at quite concertedly, was something that provided some guidelines for further action. And so we started to see something called the conditional grant that was given to look at the infrastructure of the preschool centers. Still nowhere enough, but the community-based models were able to strengthen themselves a little. The other thing that we saw was that because there was a concern about quality, the guidelines for quality services started to emerge. So the service standards in the guidelines made its way to what was still very difficult for us to understand. Who does early childhood belong to in terms of the ministry? At that time, it was a bit of education, and it was the social development that was starting to feature. One of the greatest things that we have to offer the world is the way in which we approach the grade R scale up universal provision. So we are now at a stage that we have universal provision that has taken a long time because of the complexities of doing it. And so the access is there. And at the time when the policy came out at 2001, we thought, by 2010, we should have more or less majority coverage, but it was not to be. What happened was that the complexities around the access and infrastructure and curriculum and so forth actually complexified it. But what we do have now is we have the grade R's in the school, attached to the school, benefiting from the resources at school. But an audit in 2013 showed that in a country that is deeply divided, when you open up a service like this here, who is likely to benefit most? And the study in 2013 showed that grade R was having a greater impact on the wealthier population of our society than it did the poorer children. So the access was there, but the quality was a problem. Next slide, please. And so in the next bit of the maturing democracy, I would argue that we had many breakthroughs, and these continue to evolve. So it's a very interesting scenario of shifting from a very separatist system to amalgamations to prioritizing 1 year of preschool education and coming down and understanding that a majority of our children actually live with families. And so that we would have to look at the first 1,000 days, for example, very concertedly. And that we started to understand more deeply alternative models to center-based provision. And center-based provision now is complemented in the Children's Act with other models such as the home visiting programs, the neighborhood playgroups, the mobile preschools. So these are different forms of services that are on the early childhood landscape in South Africa. And we must thank our local non-governmental organizations for trialing these, for evaluating these, for bringing to the fore the government's attention of the shortcomings for holistic early childhood development to affirm the democracy that we were so euphoric about in 1994. So one of the things that we have seen now, if I look back from 2025, is the way in which the political leadership has changed, and slowly how early childhood has risen to an APEC priority during the ANC-led government. And we now have a government of national unity where intersectoral collaboration is affirmed, and we have structures where multiple voices can be shared on early childhood practice, policies, and the kinds of institutions developed for teacher training and so forth. And another big milestone that is notable is that the way in which the Department of Social Development was honing into early childhood development was concerning. The education component was being relegated and not given enough attention. So the institutional shift of the lead ministry from the Department of Social Development to the Department of Basic Education took place in April 2024, and it's 2022, and it's commonly known as the function shift. And things really started to move once the lead ministry had its home and all the technical bits in terms of what was happening in early childhood as baseline and how we should navigate forward. And one of the things that we are starting to see is a whole lot of evidence-informed policy making and practical implementation of different kinds of programs and so forth. So in 2021, the census that we had, supported by the Lego Foundation, and the Thrive by 5 index that we had, gave an indication of the infrastructure for early childhood, the status of children, the areas of the workforce that needed attention, and other things as well. And so one of the problems that continues to haunt us is the whole issue of unregistered sites. And so here as well, it was the NGO that showed the road to how you could do this. So the mass registration drive is underway under the banner of Banapele, and we have the digital e-care system, and of course, attention has been drawn to subsidies as well. And here's another big thing for low and middle income countries in terms of what happens when pressure comes from the outside into the government space. The funding and subsidies that were given to the early childhood centers, 17 Rand, remained stable for 6 years. And the advocacy that came from the field has now pushed it up to 24 Rand per day. And we are very proud to say that organizations like Real Reform, together with other pressure groups, have now made the government think differently about funding early childhood. And so we are happy to learn that the 10 billion financial injection into early childhood is most welcome. The other thing that we could learn about building a democracy is the government alone cannot do this. So we have a lot of private and public collaboration under the banner of a social compact. And so over time, our local NGOs, and you can see the names of all the INGOs that have come on board in order to support the government in different ways. And I think that what is happening in South Africa is the strengthening of the domestic economy and the understanding that we would have to look at different kinds of innovative models of financing. And as I speak, that kind of activity is going on based on a very interesting report that was supported by the World Bank on the public expenditure review and other kinds of data. And so we do have what is called a quality control framework that had lots and lots of input to make it contextually responsive, that values the indigenous knowledge and practice, that takes seriously multilingualism, that takes seriously play-based learning, and so forth. Next slide, please. And so what is it that we learn from the South African experience? So it's not all honey-coated. We have serious wicked problems that are just stubborn and don't go away. And they have to, you have to work a lot with possibility thinking in uncertain times. And of course, we, exacerbated by the pandemic and what it has done to the gains in early childhood. But be that as it may, we have some very good starting point for building a foundation of democracy, of equity, of collectivism, partnerships, and the breaking of intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. So what we have seen is a coming of epistemic justice to the fore, the coming of social and economic justice in terms of the redistribution of resources and so forth. And so the tale that we tell is, and I won't read everything there, but it's just to say to you that here was the starting point. And here is where we are headed towards. So if I take the first one, from exclusion to equity, and many, many doors open up. And if I think of myself, I grew up in the apartheid era, and here I am now, a professor in early childhood, one of the first professors to enter the professoriate. These opportunities would have never been available to me, but the way in which the government reconstructed society with warts and all allowed for many people to experience many opportunities and to flourish. And as a result, we saw the building of a de-racialized middle class, for example. And so that whole welfarist approach of look after me and, with just amount that I think you need to have, gave way to rights. and gave way to forums where people, moved from silence to voices. So I think that the South African story is a very good one to say, to tell, through the lived experiences and from what the world can learn in terms of valuing people, its sense of knowing, and allowing them to flourish and have their bit of action of what is due to them. And with that, I thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professina, for that inspiring input. And I think today we were very privileged to have heard from you, Professina, from Sarah, and from Jan. And you've taken us on a journey, learning from the past. You've confronted us with our present, and you challenged us to make sense of what is in the present. And now you have also given us the tools and some thoughts about how do we create this sustainable future for our children in South Africa and in every corner of this world. And it's really great to be part of this discussion. Perhaps it's time for some questions. And we have about 15 minutes left that we can use for questions. And I think it's appropriate to start with the first question that we received in the chat, because it's a question that brings together what Jan, Sarah, and Hasina have shared with us this afternoon. And the question is from Tom, and it says, how can early childhood education systems in politically stable but socially unequal societies adopt lessons from transitional contexts, such as post-Soviet states or post-apartheid South Africa, to foster democratic values and inclusion without the catalyst of major political upheaval? And I think that question sort of just brings it all together. And I'm not going to prescribe who's going to go first or who's going to venture first. I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to allow you to ponder. And if you are ready to provide an input towards contributing to that question, you're most welcome to do that. Jan, Sarah, Hasina, it's over to you. You can just unmute and then let your voice be heard. See, Jan, you've unmuted.
Yeah. But we had a lot of discussions when we were writing the book about that. So about transitions, if any transition has opportunities for going to a more democratic approach in early childhood education, and unfortunately we think that it's not every transition. Like what we are for the moment, what we are seeing in the world is also a transition, but it's a bit in the opposite way. So it's not every transition gives opportunities, but the ones in South Africa and in Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 90s were giving a lot of opportunities. But I think, and I'm very hopeful, that there will be again a reaction towards a more democratic approach in the future, and I hope that the young people will again understand the values of such a democratic approach and an inclusive approach. But I think the transitions we're seeing now are not so positive for. But I don't know what my colleagues are thinking.
I have to come in here, yeah, and I'm also with you. Like, it's true that when something comes to you, you have to, critically analyze it contextually to see, is this good for our children or not? And in the South African context, I think that one of the things that happened in our past was compensatory education. So you look at what is the learning deficit, and you look at what are the kinds of approaches we need to deal with these deficits. And out of that was born a very rigid and narrow interpretation of, for example, school readiness. What we're seeing now, I'm busy with teaching practice evaluations now in our first year of preschool informal education, that's grade R, is a lot of formal didactic approaches in the name of standardization and access to opportunities. So I think that what has happened there is, and we're starting to see the level of vulnerability of the children, the COVID babies that are coming now into these classrooms. They need more of the psychosocial support and the life skills support that traditionally is associated with early childhood, child-centered education. And so I think that, when something comes to us, we need to ask how contextually appropriate is it for where we are now in our particular context. And that's just one example of the formal creep within the first year of preschool education, within basic education.
I was going to add kind of two comments. So one is related to the question, part of the question, which is about, how do you make change without having a revolution or a big political transition? But I think what you need is political will. I think that's very common in both of these. You don't need the revolution to get the political will. You could get evidence-based political will. You could have political will that comes from the ground up or from the top down, right? So you just need the political will, I would say. You don't need the transformation. There was something that Professor Hasina talked about that really made me think, and it also is in this question. We keep talking about democracy and inclusion, and they are part of the same thing, right? Democratic systems are inclusive. But educationally, there's also some variation here, or something that's a little bit different that I wanted to emphasize a little, which is that Jan spoke about the Roma and the inclusion of Roma, and Head Start does a lot on inclusion of children with special needs and all of these things. And I think, I talked about some democratic pedagogies, but I think when we talk about inclusion and breaking things down so that doors are open, whether it's apartheid or whether it's for children with disabilities or if it's for Roma children, we really need the human rights. And I can say that when I was doing my own research and things on Serbia and the UK and Roma children, a very critical moment happened outside of the education system, which is when the human rights laws passed that said that everybody had to be treated equally. And as soon as that happens, the education system has to adjust, and if it doesn't, it's held to account. And I think those were very important moments in both places, and they stimulated change without a revolution, maybe. But this was really, really, really important to both things. And then the other piece is a sensitivity that those kinds of social justice changes mean changing people's beliefs and attitudes. And you can't do that with a club. We did a lot of trainings every time we worked with Roma communities or integrating children with disabilities, to do trainings for parents and teachers on embracing diversity and on social justice and on thinking about their own biases. And I think that part of it is the laws and part of it is individuals. And I think we have to think about both of those things. And maybe, democracy includes inclusion, but inclusion takes more. It takes more than having the morning meeting and parents. You have to do a lot of extra things to have the meaningful inclusion.
I found what Sarah, what you've just shared now again, and that came so beautifully through in the presentation, is that whole notion of building hope and building on hope. And for me, an investment in early child care and education is building on hope. And I think that for me is so important. And I'm so glad to have seen it come through in the presentations, both from Jan, Sarah, and from Hasina as well. I want to go to a question that Patricia Paula have shared. And she said, can you share a few concrete examples of democratic, inclusive pedagogies that you've been using, or perhaps that you know of that is being practiced today? And in a way, Patricia, I think your question might be answered by Professor Ebrahim, but for the moment, I wonder if Jan or if you or Sarah have any reflections on that question.
Jan, do you want to say something, or do you want me to say something about just to say, so we really looked at democracy in the classrooms, and USAID, when it existed, funded an evaluation of the program after a few years, and we looked at classrooms that had the program and classrooms that didn't, and we looked at what we call democratic behaviors and things. We tried really to change the approach in classrooms. So a few sort of technical things. We organized in every classroom a morning meeting that built a sense of community. We insisted that every kindergarten have a parent room. So this was very interesting because parents weren't allowed into the Soviet kindergartens. You bring your child to the cloakroom and you leave them. And then the state takes over and you come and pick them up. So they had a room, they could have coffee, they had some money they could use to give bonuses to the teachers or to buy vitamins or things like this. So they really were part of also the governance system inside the kindergartens, which was important. And then at the level of activities of children, we reinforced the idea children had to make choices about where they would play. They had responsibilities helping to set up lunches or snacks and take down snacks. And we really enforced the ideas of things like critical thinking, and teachers, we asked that teachers also individualize towards children. This really hadn't been focused on before. Most of the activities in the earlier classrooms were whole group teacher activities. And so we broke the classroom down into sort of a learning environment with different activity centers where children chose, and then where there was sort of thematic activities where activities were, children could do them at their own level, work together and things like this. So these were some of the approaches. And what we saw was that children could express themselves and parents were very involved in education. And children could also make choices and take responsibility. These were some of the maybe concrete things that we looked at when we were thinking about what does democracy look like.
I worked in Eastern Europe for UNICEF. And so then when I worked there, I had to do several visits to early childhood centers. And that was something what was really a huge difference between the step-by-step institutions and between the others was, for instance, the way they treated Roma children. So the Roma children in normal schools were not very well treated, but in the step-by-step programs, you saw that there was a very good relationship with the parents. I visited some centers for Roma children, which were really great, where the children were very active, participating. So they really succeeded in making a difference in practice. And that was one of the reasons why I get from Western Europe, I get so interested in the step-by-step program, because I saw that in every country in Eastern Europe, I worked for UNICEF. I always saw that there was such a huge difference in participation of the children, participation of the parents between the step-by-step institutions and the other schools.
We do not have any more questions. And before I perhaps venture to ask a question, I'm just wondering, if there's any thoughts that just jump to mind that any of our speakers would like to voice out. So I just want to give an opportunity for that.
I'd just like to add this whole concept of, when we are introducing new ideas and what have you, and, I work a lot with communities and so forth. And if you don't give them the opportunity to first really think through and contribute in different, using different kinds of participatory methodologies to who am I? And, like Sarah said, in terms of the beliefs and the values and what have you, because a lot of it is like inbound. They haven't witnessed their own thinking about an issue. And so when they start to witness that and they connect with what is being presented, then it creates a possibility to ask, what of me is in this here? And if it's nothing, then that is a point of discussion in terms of how do we bring your world and this world we're proposing a little bit closer together? Because in the communities like that, that we do research in, you find that parents do need assistance with conceptual development, for example, in the home-based care models and so forth. And so that's an expansion, but you start off with where people are, and then this nudging that happens becomes more palatable to them in terms of what they have to do. So when it's too stark and, top down, and it's asked the wrong question, for example, using an indicator in a poverty situation of how many books do you have in your home, to really being sensitive to what people can offer, given their particular kinds of circumstances. So, yeah, I guess what I want to say is that this identification point really needs to be unpacked in terms of entry into a new space with the communities where change is intended.
I think for me, Prof, that links up to something that you've mentioned in your presentation, where we need to guard against just a technical and technicist imperative. And we need to guard against that becoming the main engagement in early childhood care and education. And we need to look at and have a strong voice in promoting play, in promoting that freedom of expression within childhood, in promoting opportunities for practitioners to engage with children through play, and to be sensitive towards the whole society and community within which that happened. And I think through the Funda Udlale Nathi program, or VVOB, where we focused on learning through play, that is one of the areas that we strongly use to kind of try to bring this balance against a very technicist approach that may creep in, and to make sure that play remains the foundation of our engagement. Now I see, Alexia, you've got a question, and I'm going to read it, and I think this will be the last question. It says, I have a question about early child education materials and how relevant it is to have them in abundance. Working in very low-income countries and education systems, this point often arises as being key for a good child development. How do we address the lack of it? And yeah, anybody who wants to give a quick response, we've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I think that what we have in the West as toys for children, that you don't need it in every context. I saw, for instance, very interesting childcare centers in Zimbabwe where on farms where they worked with what the children found in the woods, and so it was really great what they did. So it's not, you don't need traditional toys to work with young children, to be creative. I think, for instance, on the Italian approach, which is not in Western Europe, but how they don't use traditional toys. They work with materials, the wasted materials, and they work with that. So there's a lot of opportunities. You don't need to work with traditional expensive toys, I think.
I wanted to say something about toys and concepts, right? So you don't need the fancy toys. I totally agree. I do a lot of work right now with One Sky, and I've connected a lot with the program Reach Up, and both of those programs really promote materials made from everyday things, right? But I want to maybe give a concrete example. Maybe you don't need fancy wooden blocks that were created in a factory like this, but you do need blocks, right? For kids to get this spatial, measure, building, destroying, physics, all these things. And you can make them out of, maybe you can make them out of old juice containers or other things, but you can't do without the blocks. And so I think when we address this question, we should think not only about what children play with, but what concepts we're giving them the opportunity and access to. Because if we have an environment where somebody has all the fancy toys and the art materials, and the other one, they have handmade toys, but they don't have access to things they can draw with, or they don't have access to things that they're building with, then we're not doing justice. So I think one thing that I really like about, for example, the Reach Up program is that they focus on concepts that children learn, and they build toys from materials that focus on those concepts. So I think that we could get a little more technical sometimes when we're, especially as we move towards getting ready for school and those things in those ways. And also training for parents and educators to help them think about how do you, I've seen great exercises where people take apart a cabbage and count every leaf of the cabbage, right? But you have to think about using the cabbage that way, or playing with the pots this way, and things like that. So I would just say intentionality is important.
Yeah.
And
That's
maybe, it's also important to think about, like, in the learning goals and the concept development, what would be an essential package for that? Because I hear in South Africa that has occurred, not to a great extent, but it has occurred, to look at the child development and how children learn, and then package materials that would be essential. And then, like, we've got the toy library concept where they borrow the toys from, it's accessible to the parents, so that, you get some kind of equity there in terms of access. But also important to learn to use the environment as a third teacher is something that needs to be driven in the preschool centers as well.
Thank you to Jan, Sarah, and Hasina. What a beautiful, wonderful afternoon. You've sketched it all for us, and that was such a privilege to be part of that. And just two comments I would like to make before I hand over to you, Marie, is that what Tom says, early childhood care and education plants the seeds for hope that grow into a stronger, more resilient world. And that is what we want, and that is what we are aspiring to, and that is what this conversation was about this afternoon. In a step-by-step way, that is where we are going, to that stronger, more resilient world. Emmy, we saw your comment around the important role that teachers in early childhood care and education play. And that teachers should be resourceful, that they should not look at the deficit, but that they should look at the opportunity, and that they should unlock that for the children that they work with. And just, I have to quote our minister. our current Minister of Basic Education in South Africa is Minister Siphiwe Gwarube, and she's very passionate about early childhood development and early child care and education. And that's why one of the reasons why we see that increase in the subsidy. And she says, she challenged all of us at the G20 seminar the other day, and she says, we all need to reflect, and we had that opportunity today to reflect. We all have to learn, and we had that opportunity to learn today. And now we have to lead, and all of us are leaders in the work that we are doing. So my encouragement to you, as I sign off and hand over to you, Marie, let's lead from here in early child care and education. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Gerrit, for this very encouraging words. And thank you, Hasina, Jan, and Sarah for this insightful session. I think it's the last Connect and Learn before the summer break. So, and invite the audience and other interested parties to go to the website. The presentations and the recordings will be available before the end of this week. But you can still also have access to all the other Connect and Learns we organized the last few months. We will be back in October for our international conference on education and health. This will be a hybrid conference, and we are reflecting on the interlinkages between education and health, and the title of the conference is When Health Educates and Education Cares. Maybe important for the speakers today and for our audience is that there will be one session will reflect on the first 1,000 days of childhood. So it will be a crucial period at home and at school, especially in times of crisis. And this session will highlight the need for coordination between the two sectors, education and health, for the first 1,000 days. So I hope to see you back in October or at one other Connect and Learns organized by Educate. I want to thank all the audience and our speakers today, and special thanks also to the moderator of the day, Gerrit. And I wish you a wonderful day and hope to see you back soon. Before I forget, Larissa, she shared in the chat the QR code that you can use to have a free copy of the book written by Jan, Sarah, and other authors. So please use this QR code to have access to the copy. I wish you a nice day and hope to see you back soon. And thank you to all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. See you soon.
See you soon.